All right, we're getting going here. I'm pretty agitated because Restream is not working on like any platform. So LinkedIn is not going. I don't even know if anything's working, to be honest. So let's see. I'm very flustered because I got home on time to do this and nothing's actually working. I see people are joining on Twitch, which is cool. Thank you. But like you can it's crazy. Yeah, LinkedIn will not join, so I have to go. It keeps trying to do it to the last event, which doesn't make any sense. Give me one more sec here. Sorry, folks. I'm just trying to get myself situated. But yeah, it doesn't even crazy. Okay, well, sorry, LinkedIn. Not going to happen. Everywhere else, I mean, Instagram's not working either. YouTube is working. Hi, folks on YouTube. Finally, the YouTube audience is going to beat out the other audiences, but usually Twitter's pretty good. So that's really unfortunate. I can't believe that. Anyway, whatever. I'll give up. Okay, so topic for today is going to be about software engineering teams and different things to consider for structuring them in efficient ways. And this is just based on my experience. So if you're new to these streams, then hopefully the way I kind of explain things and walk through them, you get the feeling that I'm not telling you like this is the only way it can be, because that's not how I think about things. Instead, it's more like here's my experience, here's like lessons I've learned, and like I would much rather you hear the lesson and then you can have your own interpretation of that. So if you have a different experience, I mean, like always, your mileage may vary, right? So if you have a different experience, that's totally cool. Like, I hope someday you can share your lessons with other people and stuff. That's all I'm doing here. So to start things off, I'm going to put a link to the full article. If my computer will work, give me one moment. And that way, if you want, you can follow along. If not, that's cool too. But this is where, if you're ever curious, like where the topics for my live streams, then it's on my newsletter website. So if you want, you can check it out. This is the today's topic. Just checking where it's going. No, LinkedIn is not live anyway. It's not going there. If you're on YouTube, you should see it in the chat, Facebook and Twitch. If you're on TikTok, sorry. But it's weekly.devleader.ca. You don't have to subscribe to the newsletter if you're not into that kind of thing. That's cool. But if you're ever curious, like you like these live streams, you want to see the topic, that's where it's going to be. And of course, these are AMAs. So if you're familiar with joining these, then you hopefully realize by now, I try to watch the chat as much as possible and kind of chat through any of the questions that you have. I would rather prioritize that than the topic that's being discussed. But with that said, let's jump into this. So this kind of stemmed from a conversation on my vlog YouTube channel that's called Code Commute. And the topic that was originally proposed was around structuring like QA teams. Brian, good to see you. Thanks for joining. I'm glad it's working on Facebook and you could join. So the original conversation on Code Commute was like, okay, like, do you structure software development teams with dedicated QA? Do you have a QA team? Do you have QA at all? And I've kind of lived through all of the above in different flavors. So I wanted to share what my experience has been. But that was the Code Commute conversation. And when I wanted to write about this in the newsletter article and have the conversation for this AMA, I didn't just want to focus on like just QA and how QA is set up. And I think one of the reasons why is I think that can be a pretty heated conversation. So I wanted to share some insight about that, but I think there's this meta point about team structure that I wanted to get across. And so I called the newsletter article and this live stream Islands and Autonomy. And that's because these are two different things that come up when I see team structure that I think influence the effectiveness. So hopefully that's a okay starting point. That makes sense. But to dive into things, I think at a very high level, to introduce one side of this, one thing that I have seen work not very well is creating islands. So islands and autonomy, the one thing that doesn't work very well is islands. And I've seen this come up in a handful of different ways. So I felt like I would walk through some of these examples. And again, as I go through this, it's not my intention to say like this can never work or this will not work, but I want to share with you like some challenges I've seen with this so that if you're, and I had even someone on Code Commute commented and said, by the way, like, thank you, this is so helpful because literally the teams that I'm on or their organization, they're literally considering some of these options. So they were like, now I have, it's not a rule, but I have some data points to kind of go by from someone else's experience. So when I worked at Magnet Forensics before Microsoft, this was very much like like when I started, there was like 7 or 8 people. And the idea of testing in general was like, did not exist, which sounds kind of funny. But I mean, that is like a role, right? So we didn't have any like unit tests or coded tests in the code. We didn't have QA or testers. Hey, Ryan, good to see you. Hopefully it's a helpful topic. So thanks for joining. But yeah, we didn't have like, there weren't testers, there weren't QA, and the no coded tests. So like, we literally kind of started from, from the very basics of like, we got some code. How do we like truly turn this into like a software engineering organization? And so early on, it was like, okay, we're going to hire testers. And so we'd bring on testers. And one of the other things I should mention too, is that we're going through this is like, we were really trying to figure out kind of like I was hinting, like, how do we be a software engineering organization? Like what's involved with that? Right? We like, have I worked before in like a software engineering organization? Yes, I had, at that point I had 6 internships. So I'd had like 2 full years of, working in software engineering teams, but this is a brand new company. And like, I should mention, it's not founded by software engineers, right? Like the people that founded this company weren't like, hey, I'm a software engineer, I know exactly how this is done. So we're like, we got to make this work and figure it out. So what's interesting is we said, okay, well, we know that we value quality. We should test the product. We should bring on testers. So we started doing that. And then when we were scaling up the teams, we're like, okay, well, we should hire developers and testers, but we're kind of scaling up and we're kind of figuring out agile and stuff. And we don't really know what's going on, but we got to try things. And so we were set up to do sprints. So if you're not familiar with like some, I don't know, some pretty simple agile concepts, like a sprint would be a period. And for us, it was 2 weeks, but these are sort of arbitrary. You can set them to be whatever you think is appropriate. And then at the end of a 2-week sprint, we would come up with new commitments for work for the next sprint. We would do a retrospective and talk about things. We kind of planned for a sprint. So in our case, 2 weeks at a time. And what we did was we actually had the team of QA as a dedicated team. And then we had like the developers that were on one team to start with and kind of split into a couple to work on different areas. But the point is that we just had QA as like a unit, as a whole team, and developers separate. And this was, okay, so spoiler alert, this did not work well. But it like we tried this for what I think is a very good reason. And we were looking at sort of in isolation, how do we speed up developers? And in isolation, how do we streamline the work that the testers are doing? So what we did was we had these these separated teams, and then we also staggered the sprints, right? So they weren't sprints starting at the same time. They were literally staggered. And the idea behind this, and again, spoiler alert, did not work very well, was that we could have developers kind of take their sprint commitments and they can say, I'm going to go build these features or fix these bugs, and I'm going to, crank through them. So they would land a feature, they would land a bug fix, they would integrate that into the mainline branch. And then what that would do was feed in to be work for the next sprint for the testers. And that meant that the developers could keep going, and then the testers would have this solid pipeline of work that they could chew through. And, they could go test this, they could dedicate their time to it. So, if if you have some experience, you might say, well, I know exactly what's going to happen here, and you're probably right. But what would happen was, as soon as the next sprint would start and a tester would go to pick up their very first work item, the very first, like within minutes, they would be like, this doesn't work. This is broken. Or, sure, this works, but like, this is totally unusable. Like, not the user's not going to understand this. Or I have questions, like, this doesn't make sense. You didn't do bounds checking. Like, it was whatever you could dream up within minutes, sometimes even less. Testers would be like, no, like, this is just not okay. So what had to happen? Well, either because it's in the product already, we would have to have the developers context switch because it was very urgent that they introduced a bug and we had to go fix it. Or we would say, it's not pressing enough, but we'll schedule it back in for our next sprint. So we have two problems that occur with this, at least. One of the first problems is that you have this ridiculous context switching. So, you introduced a bug, like, yep, now you got to go fix it, so get back to that. Or you have this huge delay. So you've landed a feature, now like 2 weeks later, you have to go back into it and like go make updates to it. So we set this up because we thought it would be efficient for either sort of role, and it was terrible. Absolutely terrible. And I think that came down to some of the mentality around this stuff was we were trying to optimize things, but really what we were doing was being like, not, obviously it wasn't as explicit as this, but kind of what our actions were saying was, I'm a developer, I don't care about the quality, that's your job. Right? That's what was happening in practice. I'm just going to code all of these things, not my problem, now it's your job. So that's one example where we had things set up in islands. So when I talk about islands in these examples, the concept here is that we have individuals of a particular role or focus area that are truly operating on an island together, separate from, say, a core team. Another example I've seen with this is with documentation. And, like if we deem that documentation in terms of like technical writing or help guides or whatever else it needs to be, if we're saying part of our product releasing is that documentation has to be up to date. At one point, we had sort of like an island, again, use the concept here, an island of documentation writers. Now, what that meant was the same type of thing would happen, except maybe not as obvious, because I think the relation between developers writing code and things being tested is a lot more tangible, where people can relate to this. But with the documentation writing, it was similar, right? So someone would go build something and they're done, but now it's like, I don't know, like someone's got to write the documentation. So when's that getting done? Oh, the documentation can't be done on time. Do you pull the feature out because you can't write the documentation? Well, someone's going to say, no, that's ridiculous. Like the feature's already in there. It's already doing the work. Like, no way. So now you're saying the documentation's not important? Well, no, the documentation is important. Okay, so is the release date not important? Oh, well, no, we need the release date. Well, one of those things at least has to change. And more often than not, it was the documentation. We would say, like, we can ship this without the documentation, we'll follow up with it. But the point of this is truly not to say, like, hey, documentation isn't important. The point of this is to say we created an island with a role that we said this is going to be a necessity for shipping this. And then we created a bottleneck because of that island. So again, the island became this thing where if we have the island, we think it will optimize stuff. In practice, absolutely not. I see some questions coming in. So, and hey, Gabriel from Brazil. Awesome. That's sweet. Thanks for being here. I'm going to jump over to the questions in just a sec. But I just wanted to finish up this thought with one more example. And that's with even with product owners. Okay, so I've seen this become interesting, and I try to share examples where it's like you can see maybe both sides. So I've had it with product owners, and to kind of paint the picture here, again, take an island. You take all the product managers in this case, you put them onto an island. You have the product management team. If they're not working alongside the core team that they're product managing for, you now create this separation of different priorities. Now, if I put my manager hat on, I can totally understand that you might want to have product managers report to a product manager. By the way, is my stream super choppy? If someone wants to let me know, that would be great. I can see like some of the playback from Restream, and like it was frozen for like 15 seconds. But let me know. But the whole point of the product manager example is like, I can see from a reporting structure, and I can see that you want to keep people aligned to talk about things that are related to customers. But again, with this example, when you create the island, people end up having different priorities. And if they're not integrated together, working on things together, the more separate you are and the more that you're isolating each other on these islands, you truly create silos. So it's less clear for communication, and your priorities become more opportunity for misalignment. So being able to work together and ship value becomes more challenging. There's inevitably more friction because of impaired communication and difference in priorities. If you can reduce the impaired communication and you can get your priorities aligned, you can work around this. But having the islands actually makes this more challenging. Okay, jumping over to some of the chat. So Ryan's saying, I have to admit, I am personally one of those bottlenecks. Okay, definitely curious how to fix this for myself, along with building up the team I'm on. So Ryan's saying, I work in healthcare. One of the bottlenecks that I have run into is have these system integrators that handle the central software, crucial for HL7 messaging. I have no idea what that is, but it sounds fancy. Sounds very healthcare-y. I've seen some leadership believe that if anything with the HL7 messaging needs to be changed, then they need to be the ones to do so, since it's their system, bread and butter. I personally believe that you should always perform the work in the place that makes the most sense. How do you suggest to approach these leaders and help them better understand that doing the work where it makes sense instead of just the same place all of the time? So this kind of like the sort of the next phase of this conversation is like, I'm giving you all the examples where we have these islands. And again, I think that on the surface, and I'm saying this because I literally lived through this multiple times of saying, we put people on an island because we think it's going to be awesome. And then we're like, shit, it's not that awesome. One more quick example is with architects. I've seen software architects pulled out from teams, and you might have heard, what do they call it? Like the ivory tower architect. They design things. They're going, this will be perfect. This is my design. Teams go off and do it. And then the teams are like, what the hell are you talking about? That's not going to fit in here. This is ridiculous. And there's a huge misalignment because the architect just built what they thought was perfect. And the teams are like, that's not going to fly. Like, it's going to be so much work. We're so far away from that. Do you want us to ship value, or do you want us to ship architecture? As an example. So for Ryan, in your case, I think what needs to happen here is the next part of the conversation, which is explaining when the bottlenecks come up. This is probably the first part. When the bottlenecks come up, like, what is the impact of that? Like, one thing is that it's a huge risk. And I think that that's worth calling out. So single point of failure, huge red flag, right? So if you have a single point of failure where that needs to be done in one spot, say if it's truly a single point of failure, like one person, big no-no, that needs to be addressed. How do you get the skills, the expertise? How do you spread that knowledge? That's one part. If it's a team and that's a single point of failure, right? What happens now is, and I think what you can do with people in leadership is, if you have examples of, hey, remember that time you dropped this onto the team and you said, you got to get this done. What did that delay? And if the answer is, well, that delayed nothing and no one was overworking and everything was fine, maybe there is no issue. But was there actually a delay? Like, did people have to reprioritize things and something had to fall off? If that didn't happen, were people working after hours to try and make this stuff happen? Talk about the impact that it's actually had. I think that's beneficial to understand, because I think what happens is that sometimes people see this as like they're on the outside of it and they go, well, this seems like the right thing to do. And it's not a malicious thing. They get comfortable doing it. They've seen it work. Just do it again. Right. So it's not like it's hard to blame people, but if you can present like information and say like, hey, we should talk about the effectiveness of this, I think that's important. I think another thing is like, what are some solutions? What can we do differently? And which is kind of the next part of this conversation, which is the opposite of islands, and that's autonomy. So instead of having, and spoiler, but I'll talk more about this, but instead of having islands with roles, you think about teams as an autonomous unit that can tackle things. And that means that they have less opportunity to get blocked on other teams with different priorities. And you can kind of take the roles that are needed to make something happen and put them within the team. If that means, I'm not familiar with HL7 messaging, but it's like if you need an HL7 messaging sort of some expertise like that across different teams, so you don't have one single point of failure, maybe that's what has to happen. And maybe you have 10 teams and you don't have 10 experts. Cool. Do you have 3 of them? Can you sprinkle those people out? Can you start to teach the other people and sprinkle that expertise around? So in this case, it's less about a particular role and more about like a skill set, but it's truly enabling teams to be able to have some of that autonomy. So Ryan, let me know if that helps to start with. And if you have any thoughts or feedback on those suggestions so far, please just, great job for providing all the details so far. Thank you. And if you want to add more or take a different angle on that, just let me know. Romeo Sweeney, what's your take on the H1B debate? I don't want to really get into politics and stuff, to be honest. It's I don't know. I have opinions about this kind of stuff. I feel like it's not a good spot for me to like whine or complain, and because I'm not doing anything about it. So instead of me just adding like noise to it, I just feel like it's not really worth me talking about. To be honest, I'm on a visa working in the U.S. I'm not on an H1B, but I'm on a visa working in the U.S. So you can probably assume what most of my position is. But yeah. So sorry, Romy. I'm not gonna go too deep on that. Choose a reality. I've also seen these islands add friction in the case of streams and merging, where the islands are a bit more of an autonomous team, but used as a way of coordinating work on new versus live things. Yes. That's an interesting one. And actually, I can speak to some of this because I led prototyping teams before, and we often made the new exciting things and had them integrated. So I think that's a good thing. So I guess semi-autonomous islands more a hybrid thing. Yeah. So let me come back to that one, because I think that's an interesting thing, right? So my meta point when I talk about autonomous teams is about the role and function with their business value. So for example, if you want to set up a team and you're saying, hey team, you are going to be responsible for shipping this product. Like, this is your thing, you own it, or this is your service. Like, you need to make sure it's up and healthy and meeting all these metrics. Like, you want to set teams up with a charter that's very clear and tangible for them to own, right? You're the metrics team. You're going to support getting all the metrics and having infrastructure for the other teams to leverage. Like, that's your charter. I think clear charters, and I think also defining like the space of product or service deliverables, I think is really important. But within that, now, especially from my perspective as an engineering manager, like, what goes into that? Okay, well, we're a software development company. We're going to need developers. Okay. Now you can have this debate about testers and QA. I can come back to this if there's time, because in the code commute vlog that I mentioned, I talked about how we leveraged testers and then did not, and how we leveraged hybrid roles that were not testers, but more like a testing architect, and had a lot of success with that. So I can talk more about that after if people are interested. But the whole idea is like, what goes into a team that you need to be able to deliver effectively. So I mentioned documentation earlier. Okay, if documentation is going to be a critical requirement of you being able to deliver your software, if it is, do you need a role for that within the team? If there's enough documentation to write, perhaps. Or is this a responsibility that has to be taken on by the team? I'm losing my voice out of nowhere for some reason. So you have to think about roles like that. If you're going to have testers, like same conversation, right? And this is more nuanced. I know that people will have strong opinions about this, but you could say, like, is this something that you need a role for? Is this something that's a responsibility of the individuals on the team? I have the same opinion about product managers. I I have worked most of my career without product managers embedded on the team. I have seen it work, and I've seen it work mostly because the product manager is either responsible for only one team, so it's almost like they're directly embedded, or they're responsible for like one major team and like a smaller team. And they can split their time and it works because they're not juggling that much. But the point is that they're able to balance it. So I like thinking about having these roles within the team as much as possible so that you don't have bottlenecks on other things. That way, when the team is planning for how they need to deliver stuff and get stuff done, they can focus on their priorities. And inevitably, there's going to be dependencies with other teams. Because if you're building a suite of products or you have one product and multiple teams contributing into it, or you have platform teams and you need like new features from the platform team, this stuff's going to come up. It comes up no matter what. So it's not about saying, oh, look, Nick's trying to propose a way to eliminate all of the friction, all the dependencies. No, that's not my point here. My point is to minimize the overhead and the friction on a regular basis. And personally, from my experience, when you start taking these islands, right? Take the architects from the ivory tower, embed them in the team, bring in that skill set, right? Have people responsible for architecture within the team, have people responsible for testing within the team, for documentation writing, whatever is important, have it within the team. Now your team can move forward as a cohesive unit and go tackle stuff together. So that's sort of the meta point around the autonomy part. And I'm just scrolling through the article to see if there's anything more, because I usually find when I do the live streams, I blab a little bit faster through these. Single points of failure. I wanted to talk about this a little bit more too. Because I talked about some single points of failure with the island kind of setup, but I wanted to mention that single points of failure for when we're looking at like a healthy team and an effective team, a single point of failure does not have to be like, hey, we have this island of people like the documentation writers, and they're the single point of failure. So let's do something about that. A single point of failure can truly be like one person that could be on a different team, or it could be within your own team. So, with the architect example, right? If you have, you might even have, okay, so I use architects already with like an ivory tower approach. Let's take a different example. Let's pretend you have a team of engineers, and there's on the team there's someone that is, they're the most senior engineer on the team, and depending on who's watching and your experience and stuff, there is what's a good way to put this? I don't know how much I'm allowed to like curse on YouTube, so I never do, but the phrase is like intelligent asshole. And there's someone who is very smart, very technically savvy, but they're like difficult to work with. They basically steamroll a lot of conversations, and a lot of the time it's not malicious or anything. They don't even realize they're doing it, but it's kind of their part of their personality or their persona to steamroll conversations. They're suggesting things. Their way is basically always the right way. They don't necessarily always back things up because like they don't need to. They're the authority, and it makes it really difficult for other people to get their work done. Now, if you've worked on teams with someone like this, not only a whole different conversation about correcting that, but like they become a single point of failure. And that's because any pull request or code review that has to happen, they need to review it. They need to sign off on it. And more often than not, they want everything changed, right? It's not up to their standards. It's not how they would have coded it. So go change it. But they're doing this on every pull request and code review. So it's almost like they might as well have just coded everyone's code. They might as well have done everyone's design doc, right? Because like it's not up to their standards for their design. And people like this, and one of the many reasons why, as a manager, this is something I need to be careful about and try to correct within a team, is like it creates a single point of failure, and that's like it's just not acceptable. There are other reasons for why this type of person is challenging, but single point of failure is one. The I kind of actually I'm looking at my article. I mixed two people together, so you can also have this type of thing happen when it's not an intelligent asshole. It's just like a senior person on the team. And that could happen if, say, on your team you have pull request rules. It's like the senior person, or senior person has to sign off. I saw Choose a Reality said in the chat, the domain expert. Okay, domain expert has to sign off on your pull request, but there's only one, right? They are the domain expert. That's one single point of failure. So when I talk about single points of failure in this context, this is something, again, for engineering managers. I think it's really important to think through to create healthy teams that are effective. But I would also say, like, if you're an individual contributor on the team, this is something to have awareness about. I think some people, I hope this kind of perspective's changing, but I think sometimes people have historically been like, oh, single point of failure, that's called job security. Like, they need to keep me. Not really. But I think the other thing is, like, if you're observing something as a single point of failure, I think this is something that you should try to vocalize within a team. You should try to bring awareness to it so that if your manager doesn't notice or whatever it happens to be, like, there can be some action that's taken, right? So it might not be immediate, right? Like, I'm not suggesting you say, hey, look, like, there's only one domain expert, so therefore we snap our fingers and now the issue's gone. No, but if there's only one domain expert and say your manager wasn't fully aware, it's like, oh crap, like that's the one single point of failure that's becoming the bottleneck for people's pull requests in this area. Okay, like how do we start skilling up other people in that area? Right? Like how do we work towards removing this single point of failure, this bottleneck? So I think, yeah, my recommendation is, like, if you're an individual contributor, please try raising awareness about this stuff. I think it's important. Hopefully, as the manager on your team's able to have visibility into this kind of stuff. But yeah, Architect. Oh, it is live. It's definitely live. It's absolutely live. Just not on LinkedIn today because Restream didn't work for some reason. I don't know why. Kind of dumb. And I couldn't do it to Facebook. Or sorry, I'm doing it to Facebook. I'm not doing it to Instagram. So kind of disappointed. But it's definitely live. So thanks for being here. I appreciate it. I wasn't lying when I said these are live streams, and I wasn't lying when I said I read the chat too. But I think maybe the final part from this article, I don't know, it's not really covered in the article, but it is from Code Commute when I kind of thought of this topic in general. And that's going to be about, I want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think it's an interesting walkthrough about testers, QA, and sort of like a journey that I went on structuring teams and navigating what that looks like. So at the beginning of the stream, depending on when you joined, or if you're coming from Code Commute, you might kind of have a little bit of the precursor here, but before Microsoft, I was working at what started as a startup, and we kind of had to figure everything out in terms of, like, how do we become a software engineering organization? And when we started off and had a dedicated testing team, eventually when we moved away from this model because it was extremely ineffective to have, like, staggered sprints with a dedicated testing team, we started having testers. So when I'm saying testers, originally, and this is a bit of a nomenclature thing, we were just saying, oh, it's QA, like these are QA roles. And then we had people kind of pushing back over time. What the heck? LinkedIn? Who's on LinkedIn? And how did you get here? Oh, is it streaming to the wrong event? One sec. This is important. Yeah, it says LinkedIn use. Oh, my chat's not showing. Oh my goodness, I'm falling apart. There's the chat. It says LinkedIn user, and I don't know where it's streaming to, so I don't know how you got here. So I'm amazed. Sorry, I needed to pause for this because I don't. I still don't even know where I'm streaming to. Oh, it's streaming to the old. This is so dumb. It's streaming to the old event. This is last week's live stream. So thanks for joining. I think it's Lenny, right? Yes, thanks for joining, Lenny. Yeah, Lenny's saying with team structure, I don't see any magic formula that fits everywhere. Team should add team members that complement weaknesses. Encouraging knowledge sharing helps reduce the single points of failures. Absolutely. And that's the thing, like what I was kind of saying at the beginning of this stream is like, I'm not here to say like this is the only way to do it, but kind of like fundamentally what Lenny's saying is like it boiled down to like how can we reduce single points of failure? How can we have like knowledge shared? How can we make sure that basically the team itself can be effective without one person kind of carrying all that weight? And yeah, it's not going to look the same. So I think I'm hopefully going to illustrate this with this QA and testing example that this is the case. So I was just touching on the fact that QA and testers, we basically made I think our testers made a push to say like we want to be referred to as testers, not just QA. And that's because quality is owned by everyone. Now, I would also argue that testing should be owned by everyone too, which is where we're going to get to here. Again, all of this is my experience. I'll circle back on some of this stuff, but what happened was we started to have our testers integrated within the development teams. So you'd have the programmers and the testers. And that meant that there was no longer this like, let me go code it and then like I'll just give it to you when I'm done. In fact, I mean, this still took a little bit of time. I think a bunch of teams that we had still operated this way kind of in the beginning. And one of the things that I would say that I'm still, to this day, like I'm quite proud of is that we focused a lot on continuous improvement. And that meant that like we kind of started off trying to do agile things by the book as much as we thought, whether or not that's reality or not, different story. But we tried. And I think that ultimately when we saw things that weren't working, it's like we tried to make adjustments. So I think over time, people learned that when we had testers embedded on the team, it's not sufficient to just say, I'm going to go program this stuff, and when I'm done, I'll let you go test it. There needed to be some more interactions that happened in between. So not just waiting to the end, because like we learned historically, when you wait until the very end and say, okay, now you test it, you're going to have a rude awakening within 2 seconds when someone's like, there's a bug right away. Happens all the time. So one of the things that was a little bit unique about the teams I managed was that we moved away from this. And it kind of started by accident, and that's because we just didn't have people. So I mentioned that I ran like prototyping teams. I also ran a small team for mobile phone acquisition. So that meant that in digital forensics, we could take a phone and you'd plug it in and we would go take all of the information off of that phone, which is a fun problem to solve. So that's what my team was responsible for. And that team started off by myself and a product manager doing this kind of after hours. And we had the first prototype working when we were taking off in an airplane. I love telling that story. So then we said, okay, like basically we had approval to go kind of kick off this product. And okay, so we got to make this real now. If it's going to be real, don't we need people testing it too? So we brought on someone who is what I would call the phrase we use was a test strategist. And if you're not familiar with like the idea, kind of think about it like a software architect, but for testing. But we brought this person on, and really at the beginning, it was kind of like, we were so scrappy that like I can remember going through this phase of like, we're just trying to build whatever, tossing things together. And I can remember we reached a point where we were like, should we like start using Jira? Because like we literally reached a point where we're like, we think we need something to track the work we're doing because we're losing sight of like all this stuff going on. So like that's how scrappy it was. But we leveraged a test strategist for kind of like just any hands-on, like basically a user proxy. So they were really just being like a tester right in the beginning. We had to bring on a UX designer, right? But the UX designer, she was kind of on an island. So as a UX designer, because, okay, this product, it's going to be real. We need UX for it. Okay, so off on her island goes and makes the UX. Then she showed us and we were like, oh no, we can't do that. We're so far away from that. And this is a really cool thing that we did was we just basically started to actually work close together. So even though she was on an island, we made sure that the iterations of the user interface, we were going back and forth and like staying, on the same page. So it was a really good working relationship after where she would say, here's like the North Star for where I want the user interface to go. I get that you're not there. So let's take incremental steps and move in that direction. And spoiler alert, we never ever reached the North Star, ever. And people were using the product and they were happy. So like it didn't need to happen. We just wanted to use that as the guiding direction to head in. So things evolved though with the testing part. And the reality was that we had the one test strategist on our team, and the other teams were having like more testers, and they were responsible for like they had to go click through the user interface, and they like unfortunately they end up being like the quality guard, right? And we said like that's not really sustainable for our team. And so with the test strategist, what we were doing was saying, look, like we're not telling you that you don't get to click through the application and use it. Like we need a user proxy that needs to happen. But we have this special role. It was a really cool thing that Magna did. They hired in people that were either forensic examiners or investigators. They were literally real users. And they were hired in. And they had roles like other people in the company. So there'd be people that were like, they worked in sales. And they were previously like examiners or investigators, or they worked in training, or they worked in product, or they worked at like some, I think eventually in development, or they worked alongside the developers at least. So we had these individuals that were truly, when I say user proxies, I mean as close as you can get to a user without being a user. So we had this expertise in-house. So we also didn't need our test strategists putting as much effort into being the user proxy. Let me go use that as a user. But we used our test strategists to help us think about the gaps in our testing. So how this started to look was if you take the base scenario where if they're just operating as a tester, what we would have been doing, sort of like some of the other teams in the early days, was, hey, I made the thing. I've written some tests for it. It seems to work for me. You go try it out. And then they would go test it and be like, okay, these 10 things are busted, go fix it. And then we're okay, this is this is super inefficient. Okay, I'm going to go build this next feature. And before I actually start coding, let's sit down and talk together. Me and you, me as the developer, you as the test strategist, let's talk about the different parts of this thing. So we're on the same page, and we could bring in the user proxy as well. So the product, not quite the product owner, because we actually had a product owner as well as these examiners in-house. Let's get on the same page and talk about this. Okay, cool. We agree with what roughly this should look like. Now, test strategists, I'm telling you now, like based on what I think I want to build here, here's some tests that I think I could write for this. Obviously, when I get things coded up, we'll have another conversation, but here's what I'm thinking. And then the test strategist might say, okay, like that makes sense, but we should think maybe here's an edge case. It would be good if we could cover that. Okay, good. So we get on the same page, conversation about it. Then I would go code it up. And I know if you're a TDD person, you might go a bit crazy here, but before I wrote the test, I would say, okay, test strategist, I have something that I think is working. I want to go cover this with tests. I'm going to start doing what we talked about. And here is a build of the software. It's not pushed into the main production branch, but here's a build of it. Try it out. While you're doing that, I'm going to go write tests like we talked about. And that way I'm building in the confidence that you thought and I thought we agreed on that we need. So I go start writing tests. And what was cool was that person, because we had talked about a lot of these things, they felt comfortable that they didn't need to go test all those edge cases. They would test some of them and they go, oh yeah, like that's still broken. And I go, I know, I caught that in my unit test I was writing. And then they would go, oh, now that I'm trying this out and I have a real thing, there's a couple of extra things we should consider. Like, can you add tests for those? I'd say no problem. And then at the end, I would walk through, I could just show them all of my tests and they go, yep, I feel good about that. And what that meant is that the more we did this, the more that the test strategist was a lot more comfortable being able to walk through test cases with me in code and not have to go click through the application to verify everything. So they could spend more time thinking about where are gaps in the types of tests we're running? Like, do we need different test infrastructure? So that was a huge thing. Are we missing some general types of scenarios? And, are our conversations about our unit test coverage, our integration test coverage, are we on the same page for these things? Or are we constantly having escapes? So ultimately we use this to have one test strategist on the entire team enable the whole team to be productive this way. Instead of saying, hey, tester, go test this thing now that I'm done. For us. And to the point where going forward, not because we got rid of him or something like that, but we ended up being able, once he left the company, we didn't bring testers back onto the team. We basically enabled the entire team to think about test strategies. They were going through all of this. So it's not that we thought the role was obsolete, but we took on the responsibility and said, no, we are responsible for testing. We have user proxies to help us with, gauge that in terms of the user experience. But we are responsible for the testing and the quality. And now that we've gone through so many iterations of this, I'm not saying that we're the experts on all things testing and we can replace the test strategist, but we could operate very effectively using the things we learned. So the next team that I took on in this same context was kind of interesting because slight departure or slight change, because I maintained this team, but I ended up forming another team for a different purpose. And a unique thing about this team is that the work in terms of what's a good way to explain, the type of work, I guess, was very repeatable. Okay, that doesn't mean that it was boring or not valuable. It's just that the type of work, I don't have a better way to explain it, the type of work was quite repeatable. So there'd be new things we'd uncover, but for the majority of the time, we're the steps we have to go through are very similar. And when I formed this team, we had one tester. So it was a similar thing. It was by the way, you as the tester, you're going to be a bottleneck on this team if we do things traditionally. So how do we make this effective? And I think sort of the framing was, hey, look, in the beginning of this, it's probably going to feel like you're the bottleneck and it's going to be a bit of a pain in the butt. For you, for the developers trying to get stuff done, it's going to feel kind of awkward, kind of crappy. But The goal of doing this is to transition away from being the manual hands-on tester and to basically become the test strategist. So what that meant was that we had a lot of work that was very similar, like I said. And the first few sprints, it was like, yeah, it's painful because you're hands-on testing stuff. But we said, you need to teach us. Every time you're going through and you're finding this sort of class of problems, teach us about it. How are you uncovering it? Like, what's your thought process? So that we, as the developers, can go build this into the development process, right? We can go build that into the beginning of it. We can build tests that will catch it. And let's see if over time we can reduce your workload. And it absolutely worked. It did not mean that the tester, we just replaced them and they were no longer useful, but it meant that the tester we had could focus on the strategy. They could focus on the gaps. We could prove to them, hey, here's all the tests we have. It's everything we've talked about. Do you really need to go click through all the exact same stuff that this automation's running? No, you don't. And you can focus on things that are even more valuable now. And you caught these other things, great. Let us go learn about these and make sure we can try to integrate automation to help catch them as much as possible, because we want to improve our confidence level as we're going forward. So I think it was a really cool, I want to call it an experiment. And it worked, from my perspective, it worked very well. And yeah, just a kind of a unique experience of how we leverage testers. And I think ultimately it came down to what's really important is not I don't think it's a good use of anyone's time aside from being a user proxy, clicking through stuff. If you want to go understand how, if a user finds this stuff obvious, totally fair. I just think it's a very poor use of someone's time to go testing things on repeat by clicking through stuff. Computers are very good at that. And I think it's a way better use of someone's intelligence to be able to help focus on the strategy and areas that need to be improved with testing. So the final thing that I want to say on this is up until I moved over to Microsoft, that has been what has worked very successfully for me in terms of forming teams and around programmers and testers. Kind of we don't need a dedicated tester, but someone who's thinking about test strategy can be very valuable. And if someone said to me today, if you had to go form a team, how many testers would you put on the team? I would say I'm not putting testers on the team. Not because I don't think testing is important. It's because I want every single person on the team to be thinking about how to test. And we would need to make sure that we have a good representation as a user proxy. So that's been my experience. If I try different things in the future and they seem better, I'm not saying that what I've experienced is the perfect solution and that it can't be improved. I'm absolutely open to different things, but that's been so far what's worked best. Okay, over to the chat. I don't know how to pronounce your name, so I apologize. But it's an architecture question. When you have a moment, broadly speaking, do you prefer CA or VSA for small to medium-sized projects with a small dev team? I'm biased because I just like vertical slice architecture. It's just I have to admit, I just am very biased towards it. I don't think that I've professionally used clean architecture. I think I have professionally used a lot of layered architecture. And I've seen a lot of layered architecture be done very poorly. And I'll hand up, I'm the one who did it poorly. So, oops. But with layered architecture, I've seen that done poorly where it's a good way to explain this, where dependencies kind of bleed through the layers. So for example, if you have your data entities where what your database looks like in terms of the records, that you are able to see those in full resolution and use them in your UI layer, just as an example. I've seen that become ridiculously bad because now you want to go change your data structures in your database, and all of a sudden someone's like, you can't because you're breaking all of these UI components. and you're like, why the hell is my UI breaking because I'm changing something in the database? And it's like, oh, because you didn't translate anything between these layers. There was no separation. So I know your questions about clean architecture. I'm just making a point about layered architecture. And that's, like I said, I'm not blaming anyone. I was responsible for a lot of that. And then going, oops, how do I undo this so that everyone's not yelling at me? But I like vertical slice architecture because I like developing features in vertical slices. So what does that mean? Because I realize some people might hear that and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? I actually don't even primarily think about vertical slice architecture first, because I think that there are different architectures, and I think that there are many different ways to accomplish, similar things. And I think one of the big problems with architectures I see is that people go, this is the definition. If we have a concrete definition of this architecture, things must fit into this box, which is great until you have something that doesn't fit into the box and you force it into the box. And then the next thing you force into the box. So I like things being a little bit more fluid in terms of architecture. I think there's philosophies about different software architectures that are important that we should focus on, that are going to be slightly different from project to project, of course. But when I think about vertical slices, I think about that from a development perspective. What does that mean? Well, if you're going to go deliver a feature, instead of saying, okay, we have a feature, I'm just making something up off the top of my head. We're going to take a desktop-based application. We need the users to be able to have this part in the user interface that can fly out and show them some options that they can configure. I'm trying to make this up on the spot. Sorry. What I don't want is to go, okay, what are the different layers or the different parts of our architecture that we have to go touch? Okay, well, someone's going to have to go update the database schema for this. So like, let's go to the database team or the single point of failure person that's responsible for the database. Hey, you go land the database change for this. Let us know when it's done. Okay, great. That's there. Now, who owns the data layer? Like who owns that data access layer? Let's go land that feature. We'll go do that. And then when that's done, let's go have a conversation. Okay, and now who owns the business logic? Like, let's go deliver that feature. And it's not, maybe I'm doing a bad job of explaining this. It's not even just landing the part, but when people have to think about like sort of, let's go build out like a layer to go do this thing, I think becomes a ton of overhead. And what I would much rather see is like, we're talking about building this feature, go implement it top to bottom, right? If that means that you want to go land incremental parts of that, that's not the end of the world. But I think when you start having like dedicated people to go touch that, I think that was more of my point. Like you have the database team or the data layer team or the business logic team and then the UI team. When all of those things are very separate responsibilities, like good luck landing stuff. It's painful. However, my example was kind of bad because I do think that if you said, hey, I want to go do a small piece of this. So you have your vertical slice and you can think about it. When I think about vertical slices, I still go into layers just where my head's at. So you could go say, I have this vertical slice of work that I need to go deliver for this feature, but I want to go land the database change and the data access layer first. Okay, go do that. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's more about addressing the feature from a delivery perspective, not across teams, because I think that starts to get very messy. And then, sorry, on TikTok, there's a question from Good Citizen. Thank you, by the way, for joining in the chat on TikTok. It's the least active chat, so I appreciate it. Does a principal software engineering manager at Microsoft manage a single team of software engineers, 6 to 18 devs? This will change from team to team. So currently, I think I manage a team of 11 people, I think, that are direct reports to me. Now, it's a bit unique because it's one team of 11 people, but I think there's 4 there's 4.5, because one's kind of like virtualized feature crews, which are sub teams that work in completely different sort of functional areas. They're still on the same team in the same service area, but responsible for different components of that. So that means that with 11 people, I actually have some teams that are like 2 people or 3 people. And it's kind of interesting because it changes the dynamics up a lot. It means for me, there's a lot more overhead in terms of the different things I have to be responsible for. It's part of the role. It also means that it can be really challenging when I have a bunch of different priorities. How do I balance those? Because I don't want to like, hey, this other thing's really important over here. Like, I'm just going to pull these other people from this other feature crew over. Like, I have that ability, but like it feels very bad. So yeah, in my case, it's about 11 people in a single team, but multiple feature crews, which are like sub teams. The previous team I was on, I don't know how many people I managed, probably around the same number, but I had 2 teams. And I had dotted line reports. So for at least where we are in Office 365, the way that a lot of our teams are structured, we have like people in North America and then kind of like a follow the sun kind of approach with our teams. So there'd be people in China as well. So those individuals are not direct reports to me. They have their own manager in China, but they'd be more like dotted line reports to me. So when it comes to, managing priorities and what the team is responsible for, then I'd have some dotted line reports in China, for example. So that other team I had I actually inherited a second team. So I had 2 teams, and so yeah, it's gonna vary from situation to situation, but I hope that makes sense, Good Citizen. And then Good Citizens, I'm an upline, second line at IBM with 2 managers and architecture at IBM, 40 plus people. Love your TikTok. Thanks, man. I appreciate that. We are all we are all in on the geek way. Awesome. No, I do appreciate that. Thanks. I think it's kind of interesting. My career trajectory is kind of it's been cool to be able to go from like a startup to a to Microsoft. And like I started at Microsoft at the principal level, which I think that's cool. I feel proud about that. It's kind of interesting though, if I didn't go to Microsoft, I basically would have had shortly after I was not there, I would have had like a director title. At this point, arguably like a VP title. So kind of funny. If I look at my title, I'm like, kind of it's not as cool. But it's different responsibilities, right? So where I am now, it's like, I'm not the manager over the whole routing space, but it's a really cool, huge responsibility in what we're doing. So yeah, the level of impact, I think, it's really exciting. So, but yeah, thanks, Good Citizen. I appreciate it. Thanks for joining in on the chat. Architect TJ37, how to estimate the time needed for unit, integrated, whatever test implementation, how long it usually take. I almost never have time to write a test at work. Okay, I love this question. The answer that you're expecting is it depends. But here's my approach to this kind of stuff. When I make videos and stuff on my main channel, Dev Leader, I like to talk about testing a lot because I've spent a lot of time trying to find ways to optimize getting testing as part of development, because I think it's critical. I've seen an infinite number of examples at this point. I know that doesn't make sense, but tons of examples at this point where having tests has saved our asses. I think that they're a necessary thing to have in your software development process. However, I don't think that it necessarily makes sense to try and say we need 100% code coverage. Everything needs a unit test. Everything needs a, integration test. I look at testing as a way to build confidence. And even like outside of work in my own projects, right? I'm building something called Brand Ghost. And I've talked about this on early streams on Code Commute, where I'm sharing some like behind the scenes of like, what does it look like to go building a service and then try selling it to people? In the very beginning, we were basically saying, like, we don't have tests. Why don't we have tests? Because that code that I just wrote, I'm literally probably about to throw out. And guess what? We don't even have users right now. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's busted. Users aren't going to complain because they don't exist, and I'm probably going to throw it out because I'm just trying something. And then we're iterating and iterating, and then we get some users. Okay. But they're kind of like, good friends that are trying it. Cool. Yeah, I'll try it out. Cool. If it's busted, they don't actually care. They're just trying it out. Okay. Not a big deal. Do we need tests yet? Maybe not really. And then all of a sudden we reach this point, and this is a point about confidence where I'm going, and this is real. Like, I need to make a change to the database. I'm actually nervous now to make this change because I don't know if I'm going to break things. Maybe now we have, like, not at that point, I mean, like, maybe it's still not paid users, but it's enough that I'm like, I feel nervous that I'm going to break this. And if I have to go tell a buddy, like, Brand Ghost is going to be down, like, my content might stop posting on social media, their content might stop posting. And I'm like, do I really need to be having this conversation with myself that I don't feel confident? And to me, that's a point where I'm like, okay, I need more tests in place, or at this point, I need some, to be able to start having confidence. So for me, it's always a question of confidence. So, Architect, to answer your question, how much time, the way that I would frame this or how I've tried to address this is that I try to write code such that it will be testable. What that looks like is going to depend from person to person. But at this point in my life, not professionally, but in total, I think I've been programming for 21, almost 22 years. Certainly, most of that was not writing tests. But at this point, I've changed how I program to make things testable. That means I use C#. Some people freak out about this, but I like using interfaces on many things. Because if I want to write a true unit test, I know I can go mock out those dependencies and just isolate stuff. I also, over the past few years, have been using things like test containers a lot. That means that I'm thinking about, okay, when I'm writing code, can I at least set this up to use test containers, have a Docker container spun up, and I can go easily write like an integration or a functional test for this. So it's hard to put like a number on your question and like to give you an answer, but my point is that I've structured how I develop things to make sure that testing is minimal effort. I write code and I design software in a way that enables testing. And that way, if I go, I need to write a test on this, what's not happening anymore for me is, shit, I have to rewrite this. I wrote it in a way that's totally not testable. I'm screwed. Because now I want to go add tests, but I have to rewrite it to be testable. So I'm probably about to break it, and then I want to go test it. Like, it's a bad spot to be in. So I try as much as possible to write code that can be tested. In terms of time, as a result, it's minimized. And that allows me to make decisions about, do I want to test this now? Or do I feel pretty good about this? And if I need to come back later and add tests because I'm doing a pass and trying to make things a little bit more robust, then at that point I can say, you know what, I'm adding tests. I might as well add a few more unit tests or something else, that I have that luxury without having to go rewrite stuff. So I realize it's kind of a crappy answer for maybe what you're after, but if you wanted like more of a number, I would say if you're just starting out and you feel like you're rewriting stuff to write tests, double your estimate. And then start carving it back from there. Maybe use that as a forcing function to say, okay, if I can't allocate twice the time because that looks bad, how do I start writing code that enables me to be able to write tests more effectively? So drop your estimate. It's not double anymore. That's a bit extreme. I'm going to take an extra 50% to go write tests. I'm going to go take an extra 40%, 30%, until you're at the point where your estimates are kind of factoring in you writing tests, and that your test, like you're writing code in a way that you're thinking about adding tests. I think that's something that would happen over time. That's my recommendation, is to kind of don't say tomorrow, starting tomorrow, I'm going to get this perfect, but instead go over the next couple of months, I'm going to try to refine this estimation and make sure that I can add tests in and feel more confident about my estimates. I hope that helps. I realize it's not a perfect answer for you though. Choose a reality. Oh, I already saw a nasty word in here. How do you feel about the TDD argument that the tests themselves lead to a more solid design? Literally, I'm also more pragmatic like you though. Yeah, I think for the TDD folks, my challenge with primarily with almost anyone talking about TDD, I realize I can't generalize like this, but almost anyone I see talking about TDD says TDD is the only way that you can do things, and I just say no. And that's an argument to anyone. That's why I tried to start this stream off by saying, I hope you don't hear what I'm saying as Nick says this is the only way. TDD can be absolutely awesome. I don't use TDD most of the time. I have some scenarios where I'm like, TDD works really well for me, so I use it. And then people will say, well, if you're finding scenarios where TDD doesn't work well for you, you're doing it wrong. So, okay, that's nice. I'm still getting my stuff done and I'm happy and I'm confident in it. So, okay, like, I don't know. But I like to write code that can be testable, and I feel confident that I can write tests for it. And that way, if I need to, I will. So that's my approach to it. So if you're a TDD lover, I'm sorry, but that's my take, because I try to be pragmatic about everything. Good Citizen on TikTok says, why even estimate? It's ceremony, focusing on, as you say, working code. Yeah, I didn't get into estimates much, but going back to some of the startup days, that was one of the first things that I dropped on my teams, was estimating things, because that was the absolute biggest waste of time I have ever seen in my life. To be clear, that doesn't mean that I think a conversation around talking about how long we think things will take is useless. What I think is useless is arguing about if something's a 5 or a 7 or a 3 in terms of story points, when during that time you probably could have just made it. That's the ceremony part. I think the part that I actually liked about talking through estimates was like, are we on the same page for what this thing is? It's not the estimate. It's like a conversation about like, what are we actually building here? What's the goal? Those are really good conversations. I think for people that are doing, that need a bit more predictability in work, I think forecasting is a better way to do things. So you just remove the entire, let's estimate and pick story point cards. Just use the history. There you go. There's your forecast. Keep going. Doesn't matter. It's going to be wrong anyway. So regular communication, keeping people up to date. I think that's the best way to do it. Forecast if you want to use prior knowledge. Pardon me. Keep coughing. I don't know why. But yeah, I agree. Why estimate? I don't. Marcel? Sorry if I have your name wrong. Hi, Nick from Barcelona. Awesome. You were sleeping. What about TDD? Thank you for sharing. Nothing about TDD. We don't talk about that here. No, I was just answering a question from Choose a Reality. So yeah, TDD, I think time and place for it. For me, it's not all the time. Some of the time. To give you an example, where I find TDD works really well for me is, so I gave you depending on when you joined, when I was working in digital forensics, when we had to write things to parse unstructured data. So to give you an example, you want to recover a picture from a hard drive. It's not as easy as going to like C drive, go to this path, get the picture, because what happens if someone has quick formatted their drive, or you're trying to recover stuff from a page file, or it's like basically a part of memory, right? How do you get that picture? What if it's not the full picture? So when we look for unstructured data, it makes it trickier to go basically create like a parser to restructure that data. And I have found historically that I like TDD for that. So I have my test data to start with. I will come up with like a, here's the input and here's what I want to get back out, make my test cases and go design things to go work for that. But I don't like, I'm not a huge fan of having test structure everything for me. It's, to me, it's not the way my brain works. And I would say for people that like to do it, very good for you. Excellent. I'm happy for you. But it's like anything else. I will never tell people this is the only way. Why did the engineer estimate? Because the producers and stakeholders said we had to. Yeah, that's basically it. Why estimate? Because we don't have budget. I like TDD for validation and exception testing as well. It's like, I hope that this is actually one of the main takeaways that I hope people have when they watch my content is like, is that, hey, that was an interesting perspective or insight, and like, thank you, I will consider that. That's all, right? I don't want you to, what I don't want people to do is to leave a live stream or to watch a video of mine or read an article and go, oh, some random dude on the internet said this is the way it's done, so I guess it's the way it has to be. Like, please don't. Please critically think about the things I'm saying or what other people say. It's just information and experiences. I am sure you're all very smart people, hopefully smarter than me, and you can take information and, make good decisions with it that are your own. I just want to give you some of the data points from my experience, and then you can do better with it than I did. So I think with that said, I'm going to wrap up this stream though. So thank you so much for being here. This is where I do the kind of pushy thing where I advertise stuff to you. So if you join the stream, if you miss kind of the beginning, and Choose Reality says, I get worried when anyone starts to get dogmatic about any silver bullet, honestly. Yeah, that's when when someone's like, this is the only way. It's like, okay, can't trust anything you're saying. This is the link to the article where this conversation was based on. So again, depending on when you joined, if you're interested in Architect is asking the question I'm about to answer, next live stream will be next Monday at 7 p.m. Pacific, so exact same time. I don't have a good spot for my coding live streams right now. I want to revive those. I have basically a project at work that is taking up one of my mornings, and not complaining about that, but it means my kind of free time to do live streams is going to interfere with things like CrossFit and stuff. So like I'm just kind of making a decision that like I might have to pause those for now. I do not stream on Code Commute, so I'll share that in just a second. Architect has all the good questions, but yeah, the link I put in the chat is my newsletter. If you're interested in these live streams and you want to know what I'm going to be talking about, it's just weekly.devleader.ca. If you think newsletters are dumb and you don't want to subscribe to a newsletter that's free, that's totally cool. I'm not offended. I understand. I get a lot of email. I think I have like over 90,000 emails in my inbox at work. I get a lot of email. So I get it. But if you just want to see the article and know what the topic is, you can just go to the website, weekly.devleader.ca, dismiss the subscribe thing. There you go. You can see the latest one that's going to be talked about. So check that out. I'll jump over to Code Commute. So this is my second YouTube channel. This is the one that Architect is asking about. Aside from these top three that you'll see here, basically they're almost all done, except another couple there. These are all done when I'm driving to and from work or going to and from CrossFit. So I make vlogs. I talk about software engineering concepts very much like this live stream. It's just that it's not streamed. So to Architect's question, I don't stream on Code Commute. This is the channel that I stream on and I make like tutorial videos on, and that's my Dev Leader YouTube channel. So let me put Code Commute in the chat as well for folks. Most people, I assume, probably come from this Dev Leader channel. That's how they probably recognize me. Put that in the chat as well. But Dev Leader is, I have my podcasts on here where I interview people that have gone through software engineering and have unique stories to tell. And then tutorials, if it's a programming tutorial, it will be in C# because that's my language of choice. And then I have a bunch of other stuff too. I'm trying to see if I scroll through, you can see a bunch of stuff on testing. But other conversations are kind of like general software engineering, kind of like this live stream. And in fact, I have a couple of videos coming out between this week and next that will be both tutorials, and some of them will be like software engineering concepts. So check that out if you're interested. And finally, the last kind of salesy thing I have is that I do have courses available. So couple things to point out: if you are looking for more like career development courses, I have courses on Dome Train. Let me put them in the chat. These ones that you're seeing at the top are for general software engineering career. Sorry, they're kind of mixed in. So soft skills, getting promoted, and nailing the behavioral interview. And then the other ones are in C# and .NET. So if you just want to get started programming in C#, there's actually a bundle where both of these are available for a discount. This is Dome Train. This is not my site, but this is where my courses are posted. So there are tons of awesome courses on this site. If you're just looking for learning a lot of .NET development, everything you could possibly want is here. So I'm proud and happy to have, the getting started in C# stuff and the deep dive. I'm proud about that because like I feel like that's a really cool opportunity for me to give back to people that are just getting started. So, yeah. Architect says, I came from Code Commute. Somehow you pop in my YouTube recommendation. There we go. Perfect. And I appreciate it. So thanks for being here. But yeah, courses are available. And of course, if you guys, if you're like, hey, I don't want to buy your stuff, that's cool. I appreciate you being here. I post tons of stuff online, whether that's like on LinkedIn for text posts, memes, but I'm assuming if you're here, you probably have seen my content and stuff online. So I do appreciate you supporting. Doesn't have to be monetary with courses or anything else. Just thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk through this stuff with you. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this up. It's the last live stream of the year. So thank you so much for an awesome year. We got a full year next year, so I hope to see you more. But yeah, I hope you all have an awesome New Year's, and wishing you all have happy celebrations. So we'll see you next Monday for the first live stream of 2025.